Hello, and welcome to the Genealogy radio show. The radio show is keeping you in the loop. This week, I'm going to be talking about a very broad but very interesting topic that reaches back to Ireland's early medieval history. Many of our listeners will be familiar with the history of Scandinavian settlers in Ireland and the role that they played in this island's long and complex history. However, I think that many people will not be familiar with the full story of Norse settlement in this country. As a result, I have decided to put together this show which will cover the history of Norse involvement in Ireland and go into detail on some of the interesting surnames that have resulted from the mixing of Gaelic and Scandinavian culture. I'd like to begin with what is a little bit of historical background on the period to provide some context for the topics that I'm going to be touching on later in this show. The so-called Viking Age began around the year 793 AD and continued all the way to 1066, when Harold Hardrada, meaning hard ruler, was defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by Harold Godwinson, king of the Anglo-Saxons at the time. The defeat of Hardrada largely meant an end to the wide-scale raiding and conquest that had characterized the previous 2 centuries, as the European kingdoms became militarily more powerful and better able to defend themselves from the opportunist raids by Scandinavian factions. Before the Battle of the Bridge, however, the Norse peoples ruled the North Sea unopposed, their shipbuilding technology far outstripping that of their neighbours. This advantage meant that the Norse could raid foreign lands whenever they chose, without worrying about retaliation. A very strong position to occupy, as I'm sure you'll agree. Both England and Ireland have a long history of tangling with Norse raiders, and this is largely due to the lack of concrete power in both nations prior to the end of the Viking Age. England was divided into several petty kingdoms, with places such as Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria controlling chunks of what would later become the Kingdom of England. Ireland was similarly divided, but to a much greater extent, due to differing inheritance practices that continually divided up the estates of the Irish lords into smaller pieces. At the height of independent Gaelic Irish life, it is thought that there were around 150 small chiefdoms on the island, which in turn swore fealty to larger petty kingdoms similar to those seen across the Channel in England. The deeply divided nature of both England and Ireland meant that no one king or chief could gather enough manpower to render his lands too dangerous for the Norse raiders to target. Coastal settlements across the Isles lived in fear of seeing sails on the horizon, as there was precious little they could do but hide from them and drive their livestock away from their homes in an attempt to save them. The first recorded Viking raid in England happened in 793 AD, when raiders attacked the monastic community on the island of Lindisfarne. The community held the relics of Saint Cuthbert, which were of great value to the Christian Saxons who occupied England at the time. Monasteries were a great target for raids for 2 reasons. The first was that they were very easy to raid, being occupied solely by monks who were generally older men, and secondly because Christian monasteries were full of great treasures, such as bejeweled crucifixes and beautifully illuminated manuscripts. Evidence of this has been found in Norse burial sites, with much Christian treasure left in the graves of great Viking raiders to accompany them into the afterlife. It was not long after the first raids occurred in England that the Norse turned their attention to Ireland. It is thought that these raiders originated from Norway, as many of the Norse raiders tended to, with Denmark being the other main source. In 795 AD, the island of Lambay, which lies off the coast of North County Dublin, was raided. It is said that Saint Columba founded the monastic community there in 530 AD, and that community persisted until the fateful arrival of the Norse, who looted the place and burned it to the ground. This was another mark in the continuing trend of targeting monasteries and churches for the great riches that they often held. The sacking of Lindisfarne and the sacking of Lambay 2 years later marked the first appearances of the men from the east on both islands. In the early 9th century, the raiders began to spend time ashore in both England and Ireland, attempting to carve out homes for themselves, The effects of this decision can still be seen today, as many of their settlements survive in one way or another. The focus of Norse settlement was initially on England, but by 840 AD they had their sights set firmly on permanent homes in Ireland as well. The first Norse settlements in Ireland were not really settlements at all, but rather fortified enclosures for their ships. The name the Irish adopted for these constructions was the Long Fort. The Norse were extremely protective of their ships, and understandably so, as they were the main way for the Norse to gain wealth, and the only method of escape should the Irish somehow get over the walls of the fort. Long forts were fortified areas along rivers, usually with direct access to the sea. The word Long Fort was used for the first time in the Annals of Ulster, which records events in Ireland across a huge amount of time. The first entry in the Annals was in 431 AD, and the final one is in 1540, an amazing historical achievement. The Annals describe the first Norse settlements at Dublin, modern Dublin, and Linducal, which was situated on the River Glyde in County Cavan. As I mentioned earlier, the long forts built at both these places were not initially proper settlements, but they soon became important population centres for Scandinavian immigrants. The Irish were far less advanced in military terms than the Norse societies, which placed much more emphasis on martial skill. As a result of this, the native Irish found it extremely difficult to dislodge the Norse from their long forts, except in the north, where several Norse settlements were burned to the ground by the Gaelic lords there. By 914 AD, the Norse had begun to expand their holdings in Ireland a great deal. Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, and Cork were all founded by Scandinavian settlers during this period, and they became some of Ireland's first large towns. These much more permanent settlements in Ireland soon became centres of economic growth, as most of them controlled the island's major ports. The position of these settlements meant that they had access to the ports of England and continental Europe, allowing the Norse towns to grow into large trading centres, the like of which had not really been seen in Ireland before this time. Dublin was actually the biggest slave port in Western Europe for a time, which I'm sure will come as a surprise to many of our listeners. The Norse holdings in Ireland became part of a larger North Sea empire. One of the kings of Dublin, Sitric Ceach, who was himself a Hiberno Norseman, also ruled the Kingdom of York in northern England and the Kingdom of the Isles in western Scotland. For a time, the Norse settlers were the dominant force in Ireland. Their superior military technology and tactics, as well as their economic strength, meant that few Irish chiefs had the strength to provide any meaningful opposition. That was, of course, until the growth of the Kingdom of Thomond, home of Brian Boru, who would go on to shatter the Norse hegemony in Ireland at the Battle of Clontarf. Brian did lose his life at this battle, but he did sufficient damage to the Gaelic-Norse alliance aligned against him. The Norse never again presented the same sort of threat to Ireland that they had once done. Though most of the Norse settlements in Ireland remained in the hands of their founders, from this point on, the Irish would be in the ascendancy on the island. That is, until the arrival of the Normans in the 12th century. The defeat of the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf was a pivotal moment in Irish history. The Norse raiders were no longer in a position to do much raiding, and so settled for trading instead. That is not to say that the raids stopped altogether. Even the settled Norse in towns like Wexford and Waterford occasionally plundered the surrounding countryside from time to time. Generally speaking, though, relations between the Gaelic Irish and their difficult neighbours became sufficiently warm that a kind of normality could exist. The conversion of the Norse to Christianity helped with this, as they likely seemed much less alien than they'd once done to the Christian Irish. Inevitably, as always happens when you place two groups of people side by side, intermarriage began between the Gaelic Irish and their Norse neighbours. This led to a melding of the two cultures, though naturally Gaelic culture was dominant due to the huge discrepancy in numbers between the two sides. The people who resulted from this mix of Scandinavian and Irish became known as the Norse Gaels. As time went on, these Norse Gaels became ever more Gaelicized, though it took many hundreds of years for them to lose their identity altogether. Before this happened, though, a number of terms entered common usage to distinguish the Norse Gaels from their Gaelic counterparts. One of the most common terms that we see recorded is the word Ostmen. Simply translated, this word means men from the east, or even more simply, just Eastmen. It is not clear whether this was a moniker applied by the Gaelic Irish to the Norse Gaels, or if the Norse Gaels adopted it themselves. It was certainly widely used at any rate, and the term survived well into the Norman occupation of Ireland. Another existing term from the period is Vestmen. This was used by the Norse Gaels to refer to the Gaelic Irish. Again, simply translated, it just means men from the west, as most of the Norse Gaelic population centres were on the eastern coast of Ireland, in places such as Dublin, Waterford, and Wexford, though there were, of course, large exceptions like Limerick. The fusion of Ostman and Westman led to many new names emerging, and it is likely that you've heard some of the names I'm about to discuss, or even know someone who bears them. I'm going to give you a few examples of the many Norse Gaelic names that have survived to this day. Some of them are instantly recognizable, while others are more obscure. Let's take the surname MacAuliffe to start with. MacAuliffe is of course an anglicization of the original Irish, which sounded more like MacAulive. The Mac prefix meaning son indicates that the name means son of Auliv. The name Auliv was in turn derived from the Norse personal name Olaf. It is through these links that span hundreds of years of intercultural history that we arrive at the surname MacAuliffe. Today we can see the most examples of the name in southern Munster, and particularly in County Cork. This makes sense as the MacAuliffe family became a sept of the McCarthy clan, who were one of the most powerful families in the region prior to the Anglo-Norman invasion, which saw the Fitzgeralds take their place. I feel that I should probably explain the word sept, as it's a little bit obscure outside of a genealogical context. In its most basic form, a sept or clan is a group of people who share the same surname and share the same ancestral territory. Many septs are part of larger denominations which are known as tribes. The tribes of Galway, for example, were a conglomeration of 14 different families who were joined together by marriage and shared ancestral heritage. The folding of the MacAulive sept into the McCarthy clan speaks to the rate at which the Norse Gaels became assimilated into Irish society following the victory of the Gaelic Irish at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 AD. The modern MacAuliffes have more to be proud of than just association with a big clan like the McCarthys, though. Their family line contains many heroic figures. Some examples include Christa MacAuliffe, an astronaut who sadly perished in the Challenger space shuttle disaster. And another less recent, but still modern MacAuliffe was General Anthony Cleland MacAuliffe, who famously refused to surrender to the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge during World War II. When the German commander sent an extremely diplomatic letter to the general asking for the surrender of his encircled troops, MacAuliffe replied simply, "Nuts." The American troops under his command managed to hold out until reinforcements could arrive and push the Germans back from the territorial gains they had made. Cotter is another surname that our Irish listeners have likely heard before. This too is of Norse Gaelic origins and is thought to have come from Norwegian settlers on the island. It is thought, though not fully confirmed, that the Cotters are descended from King Ottar of Dublin. Ottar was king in Dublin for only a short time, from 1142 to 1148, but his son and grandson succeeded him in this role. The Gaelic version of the name, MacCotter, was originally MacOtter, before the rapidly increasing Gaelicization of the Ostman made itself felt. The name means simply son of Ottar, and down the many centuries since the inception of the surname, it has morphed into the name Cotter that we are familiar with today. Like MacAuliffe, the modern Cotters are most associated with the city of Cork, though there are also Cotters to be found on the Aran Islands, who still use the Gaelic version of the name like their ancestors did. The process of Gallicization was a slow but sure thing, and gathered pace as the centuries wore on. When the Anglo-Normans arrived in Ireland to stake their claim, the Osman largely cooperated with the new arrivals, as they did not have the luxury of withdrawing into the countryside like the Gaelic Irish. As the Anglo-Normans became simply the English, the Osman were accorded some special privileges, as it was understood that they were not part of the troublesome Gaelic Irish. The Osman's position in the economic centres of Ireland also meant that the English administration preferred to keep them happy. Through the 13th and 14th centuries, however, the Osman became harder and harder to distinguish from the Gaelic Irish, and the legal protections that had been gifted to their ancestors were stripped away. To the English colonial elite, one Irishman looked much the same as another, even if he had bright blonde hair. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Genealogy radio show. The history of the Norse in Ireland is a fascinating subject, and I definitely enjoyed researching it for this episode. Thank you for listening.